Hey people, it's ScionVyse here. Continuing my plan to go and look through all of Supergiant Games' work, I'm going to be talking about their sophomore project and follow-up to Bastion, Transistor. If you were to look at my Steam page for Transistor before I wrote this review, you'd see it was about 6 hours. That is a stark contrast to Bastion, considering I played that game for dozens of hours. So I don't really know why it didn't stick with me as much. I remember enjoying it, but I don't remember too much else about it. So I'm interested to find out why it didn't really stick with me, so let's have a look.
Hey, Red. We're not gonna get away with this, are we? Come on, pull.
So Bastion was a big hit. By 2015 it had sold over 3 million copies via Steam, Xbox Live Arcade, and PSN. So Supergiant had some big shoes to fill with a follow-up. They could have just done the same thing over again with a different setting and I'm sure people would have eaten it up. But not wanting to rest on their laurels, Supergiant decided to do something different. They took the foundation they built Bastion on and went in a different direction. Where Bastion was a simple beat 'em up, their next game, Transistor, was going to be something a little more unique. It was still a beat 'em up, sure, but it wasn't going to be any old beat 'em up. And on May 20th, 2014, Supergiant released it to pretty wide critical acclaim. The beginning of the game starts out the same way as Bastion, but with a twist. You get flung right into the story like in Bastion with little explanation, but where Bastion started after the apocalypse, Transistor begins when it's just getting started. The first thing you see is Red, the protagonist, mourning the corpse of someone she knew, who had been impaled by a giant sword. And of course, by mourn, I mean just pulling the sword out of his chest and leaving. However, his consciousness didn't disappear when he died. It was moved into the sword, called the Transistor, and he can now talk to Red through it for some reason. The Transistor plays a similar role as Rux from Bastion, being a bit of a tour guide describing things and places in the city of Cloudbank. However, the big difference is that the Transistor isn't describing things after the fact, telling a story. It is directly conversing with Red, influencing her decisions and guiding her as she travels. This small change makes more of a difference than you'd think. Grounding the character in the world rather than having him be more or less an observer to possible events makes him much more interesting as a character in my opinion. He is not coincidentally voiced by Logan Cunningham, the narrator from Bastion, and Red's songs are sung by Ashley Barrett, who portrayed Zia in Bastion. But more on her later. It's time for Red to start her journey. Now, Red has lost her voice, so you won't be hearing too much from her directly throughout the story. That doesn't mean she isn't interesting, but we'll go into that much later. Now, onto the game. At this point is when the game starts to differentiate itself from Bastion. You're given 2 abilities for the Transistor to use rather than a simple button combo, and each ability has a specific effect. What really sets it apart from Bastion is what comes next. Red is ambushed by several enemies known as the Process, and the Transistor comes into effect. Time is stopped, and Red is given a meter. This is known as a turn, and this is the Transistor's main gameplay gimmick. While in this turn planning phase, you can basically do whatever you want. You can move around and reposition yourself relative to enemies, you can use whatever functions you have, you can not use functions, whatever. Moving and functions both have costs, and when you run out of your planning meter, you can't do anything else. You can undo anything you have done without any penalty though, which is really nice. Once you've decided what you want to do, you just press R2 and watch your turn unfold. I tried to figure out a comparison between this and other games, and the one I feel is most similar is the VATS system from Fallout 3 and New Vegas. One thing that makes this system different though is that once you use a turn, all of your attacking abilities are unusable until the turn recharges. You don't have to use all of your turn planning if you don't want to, and it will take less time to recharge if you don't, but it is a wait regardless. The system accomplishes what it sets out to do, and since the movement and controls are so smooth, it's really easy to set up and utilize your turns very well. I spent a lot of time mulling over my thoughts on this system. On the surface it seems like a great way to add some extra strategy and depth to a traditional beat 'em up, but I can't help but shake the feeling that it just causes more problems than it solves. I'll go into a bit more detail later, I just want to give a more complete description of the gameplay in general before I start complaining. Battles themselves are pretty straightforward. Enemies spawn and they attack Red. Red attacks back, and they are defeated. The one main difference are the cells that are dropped by defeated enemies. If you leave a defeated cell around for too long, the enemy that it was will respawn and you'll have to defeat them again. This can lead to some pretty interesting turn use, as a difficult enemy respawning can be pretty bad, and using a turn to grab that cell before it recharges can end up being a pretty good idea. Now, Red can't get multiple weapons like the Kid could in Bastion. Before you get immediately disappointed, there is something similar. Throughout her travels, Red will encounter people who have been partially absorbed by the process, often people she knew or knew of her. The Transistor can speak to those people who have been processed even if Red can't, and many of these people decide to be absorbed into the Transistor as well in order to help Red. Each person downloaded gives the Transistor a new ability. The main depth of Transistor's gameplay comes from these functions and how they're used. The Transistor has 4 primary function slots which give Red her moveset. These abilities range from short-range hits to big uppercuts, or more support options like charming enemies or becoming invisible for a short time. Now, functions aren't just attacks. Each function has 3 separate abilities: the primary ability, an upgrade, and a passive. The game does tell you what each ability for each function does right out of the gate, and it even tells you how each function will interact with others. For instance, the Jaunt ability, which lets Red use a quick dash whenever she wants to, even during a turn cooldown, has upgrade and passive abilities that are related to that primary function. If Jaunt is put into an upgrade slot, the function it is upgrading can be used even during a turn cooldown and will generally come out faster. Every function works similarly to this. Now, I really like this idea. I kind of just wish the game gave more reason to experiment with different abilities and function combinations. It's really easy to just fall into a routine when you find a set of functions that work really well for you and kind of just forget that there are others that you can use. Transistor does have a few things that try to encourage the player to try out different functions. First, if you lose all of your HP, you don't immediately die. What happens is that one of the functions of the Transistor gets overloaded and can't be used for a few battles. This, leaving you with an empty slot, means that someone may want to fill that void with another function. Fun fact though, before I wrote this review, I literally didn't even know what the game over screen looked like or if it even had one. Even with limiters on, the game is so easy that the risk of actually dying is so rare that it never organically happened to me throughout my playthroughs. Secondly, while the Bastion itself is not in this game, obviously, it definitely got a spiritual successor in Transistor. Every once in a while, you will see a glowing doorway along your travels and you can enter into the back door. This is a pretty weird place. It's an island in the ocean. It has a single tree, a hammock, and a pretty 80s looking sky. The back doors are where you're going to learn the most about the Transistor's functions, how they work, and how they interact with each other in a practical way. In each of these doors here is a challenge, which tests specific functions or strategic ideas that you'll need to overcome. These range from taking out process quickly using very limited abilities, or defeating numerous waves of process using a somewhat random assortment of functions that you can use to your liking. I definitely feel like the gameplay is at its best here. Each challenge is really well designed around the idea that it's testing, and you actually need to strategize and plan things out in order to succeed. I really wish the main game actually did this more. I mean, like, challenge you by forcing you to use different functions that you don't normally use, rather than letting you just use the 4 that you get at the start forever. Lastly, each function being a person has their own story. By using each function, you unlock part of their biography of who they were and what they did. Each function has 3 sections of a bio to unlock, each part unlocked by equipping a function in either a primary, upgrade, or a passive slot, and using them in one battle. This is a really cool idea, and I really like how they tried to tie the gameplay directly in with the world like this. However, since the majority of these people you get as functions are completely absent from the actual story, it's hard to care too much about their tales. I love reading up about Red, the Transistor, the Camerata, and what they were all about, but some random person from Cloudbank that we'd have literally no involvement with if their bios didn't exist, well, knowing these people exist didn't really make me too invested in their stories. This issue could have been fairly easily fixed too. Transistor uses a level up system that's similar to Bastion's, with the main difference being you gain XP per encounter rather than per enemy. When you level up, you get a new function as well as an upgrade to the transistor itself. If level ups were mainly limited to transistor upgrades and the majority of the functions were found by traversing Cloudbank, it'd solidify these people's places in the world a bit more. There are a few you find in the world, of course, and I feel like I identified these people as a bit more, I guess, real than the ones you got from leveling up. I'm sure this feels like a pretty weird nitpick, and it probably is, but I think you'll understand why when I start gushing about the world a little later on. Now, I want to get into my issues with the turn system. The game is explicitly designed around using turns. Playing like Bastion is not very optimal. Obviously, you can attempt to just play the game without using turns, but you won't be getting the most out of any of your abilities, and there are some enemies that are designed around the fact that you have the turn and basically need to use it. However, using turns gives a huge amount of downtime where you're basically just waiting around for it to recharge again. Rather than feeling strategic, it makes the battles feel slow and dull, even when they're over much quicker using turns than not. You really start to feel like you're just going through the motions. Battles with regular enemies all feel like they turn out the same way. Now, I understand that the turns are supposed to be a bit of a risk-reward mechanic here. Using the turns gives you a huge strategic advantage, and you can basically do whatever you want. But the trade-off, aside from a few fights near the endgame with some enemies that can overload the transistor in 1 or 2 hits, isn't so much an increased risk of damage, but more of just a waste of time. On top of this, battles with standard enemies don't really get very dynamic throughout the main game. There are a very small amount of standard enemies, and while they do get upgrades throughout the game which gives them new abilities, like the Clucker enemy getting the ability to disrupt your turns for a short amount of time, each enemy isn't going to be fought in a vastly different way with these upgrades. Near the end of the game, the encounters kind of just devolve into fighting different amounts of the same enemy. This is not to say that there aren't interesting encounters, as there absolutely are, and each major encounter is far more meaningful and important to the story than any boss in Bastion was. But unfortunately, I don't find the moment-to-moment gameplay of Transistor as fun in comparison. Turns can be used outside of combat as well, but this is literally only taken advantage of once, near the start of the game, and then is completely forgotten about. There was probably a lot of puzzle-solving potential for the turn system, but considering how Red's moveset isn't guaranteed to have any particular function at any time, I guess it just wasn't meant to be. Now, I feel like I'm being a really big negative Nancy here, so I'm going to move on to some things that I really enjoy about Transistor, specifically the presentation. Transistor just oozes style. Everything about it is a huge feast for the eyes and ears. From the beautifully drawn images of the characters to the brilliant soundtrack, again composed by Darren Korb, to the wonderfully atmospheric locales of Cloudbank itself, Supergiant really outdid themselves with Transistor. Ashley Barrett lends her voice to the game and sings all of the songs written for it, and she does an amazing job. Every song is wonderfully performed, which is not only good in the self-serving, make a good song sort of way, but it actually helps the story. Red is a famous singer in Cloudbank, so Ashley singing so well really helps sell the idea that Red would not only be a well-known singer, but even the most popular one in the city. My favorite track here is definitely the end song, Paper Boats. But they're all so well done that I could easily see any one of them being any given person's favorite track. Visually, the game has a really cool look to it. It's hard to describe, but if I were to put it into words, I guess I'd call it computerized elegance. Now, this isn't just for show. The world is being portrayed as technologically advanced to the point that everything, like the weather or locations, are completely under the control of the population and can be changed at any point by a simple vote. So everything from the ground to the sky having a printed circuit board look makes sense, as the entire world is essentially programmable. It almost makes you think like Cloudbank isn't an actual real place and is just a bunch of programs and AIs that are running through a routine, and that's reset every time you play through the game. I believe that is the intention here through both the visual design and the narrative, and the transistor is the only thing that carries on into future recursions, like a big swordy USB key. Of course, having this sort of style, they do reference the 80s futurism and 2010s vaporwave look and feel in some places, most directly in the back rooms. It's a nice touch and it doesn't overstay its welcome as it's just limited to mainly that area. Supergiant really did an amazing job of creating this world. The level design, while fairly linear and not more interesting than Bastion's in an objective sense, feels so much more interesting and fun to traverse because they aren't just fragments of levels in a sky. They're city streets that all connect to each other in a real way that the characters can navigate and remember. You can visit specific locations that Red has frequented in the past, you can see posters of her musical act plastered all along the walls, and you can even visit her apartment near the halfway point for a bit of respite and pizza. I'm always down for some pizza. These little details are so meaningful because they show that Red isn't just a video game protagonist going through levels to beat up the bad guys. She's a citizen of Cloudbank, this town is her home. So when things all start to fall apart, there's a personal connection there. These little details don't only apply to the world as well, they apply to Red and her own mannerisms. At any point, you can press L1 on the controller and Red will stop moving and start humming along to any song that's currently playing. I love this detail, and during my first playthrough I remember spending a lot of time just letting Red hum to each song to see what she added to each track. You can also press R1 to have Red toss the transistor up into the air, then jump and catch it. This is completely pointless, but it's a nice character detail that shows Red has a bit of a playful side, even when things are getting pretty bad for the city. Red obviously takes the same role as the kid did in Bastion, being who the player controls and is the protagonist of the story. However, I like Red a lot more than I liked the kid. Red isn't as passive in regards to the story as the kid was. Whereas the kid would just go from place to place because that's what had to be done, Red actually has opinions and thoughts on what's going on. At terminals that are spread around across the world, you can leave comments on news stories that are currently going around. Near the end of the game, she will start directly communicating with other characters via these terminals. She will use the comment sections to talk directly to the transistor, and eventually will start emailing between herself and the Camerata. Now, the Camerata are the game's antagonists, basically. At the very least, they are responsible for the process's attack and were directly responsible for attempting to have Red absorbed into the transistor, resulting in Red gaining possession of it. The Camerata are a sort of shadow group that have a large amount of influence on Cloudbank, and they have a mantra: when everything changes, nothing changes. This is a pretty ominous sounding mantra, but it does make some sense in some way. To the Camerata, constant flux is the same as stagnation. It's still a constant, it's just to a different extreme. This alone explains all of their actions throughout the game, it explains why they need the process, and it also explains why they needed the transistor. Now, I do want to go into the story a bit more in detail now, so if you don't want to get spoiled by it, and I highly recommend you don't if you haven't played the game, I will say skip ahead to whatever timestamp I'm going to put on the screen somewhere here. Alright, skipped. Alright, been warned, let's go. After Red gets a hold of the transistor, she attempts to make her way towards where the Camerata are in order to put a stop to them and the process. She first comes across Sybil Rise, who has been fully processed and is now just another monster for Red to defeat. After defeating her, she is absorbed into the transistor and can now give Red information as to the location of the others, which she does. Red then attempts to find the next two members, and from them she learns what they truly wanted. They never wanted the process to do what it is currently doing, erasing everything. They just wanted to preserve some of Cloudbank's greatest assets for the future. To them, the fact that everything was constantly changing meant that all of the people, places, and ideas that Cloudbank stood for would eventually all change or disappear, and they didn't want that. They loved Cloudbank as it was, and they wanted to see it stay that way for a time. That's why they needed the transistor, as people who were downloaded into it stay as they were when they were absorbed, and that's what they were going to use the process for too, to maintain Cloudbank and keep it as it was. So Red makes her way up to the top of the city where Grant and Asher Kendall are holed up, and through talking to them she learns about their plan and how it all went wrong. Grant specifically wanted to capture Red, and his failure to do so is what allowed Red to come into possession of the transistor. On top of that, when the Camerata lost control of the Transistor, they lost control of the process. So they started going berserk, erasing everything rather than doing what they wanted, which was to maintain some aspects of CloudBank rather than have everything change. However, neither Grant or Asher could face Red after what they did, so by time Red reaches them, they had both committed suicide, to never see their vision of an unchanging CloudBank through. At least that's what 3 of the 4 members of the Camerata wanted. The last member, Royce Brackett, was much more aware of what the Transistor could actually do. Just as an aside here, Royce Brackett's voice actor is Sunkrish Bala. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. He is definitely the standout performance in this game here. He really sells the idea that Royce is this eccentric genius that just has got the math going on in his head all the time sort of thing. Really well done. Absolutely loved it. He knew that the Transistor had the power to do basically anything. So, his goal by the end of the game is to essentially take the Transistor and create the world that he wanted, one that is unchanging and one that he can mold to his own wishes. The process turned CloudBank into a blank canvas, and he wanted to paint. So once Red returned the Transistor to its cradle, the 2 of them were brought inside for one last confrontation. Only one Transistor can exist in CloudBank at once, so the victor of this battle will be the one to leave and create their new world. Red obviously wins this battle and escapes the Transistor. However, she chooses to be absorbed by the Transistor rather than rebuild this broken world, and dies where it all began, and leaves for the country. From this point, you can now choose to do a recursion, this game's version of New Game Plus. I really like how they handled the New Game Plus in this game as well. Bringing up my previous point about the Transistor being a USB key that stores data and transfers it to future versions of CloudBank, this interpretation at least explains why when you start it, you maintain all of the previous functions and biographies that you'd unlocked during a first playthrough. There are some other details that hint at this as well, but I think it'd be best to experience those for yourself. And with that, I finished Transistor. I'll be honest here, this was a really difficult review to write, because while there are a lot of things in this game that I adore, and I mean adore, the moment-to-moment gameplay just doesn't keep me invested long enough in between the main story beats and bosses. That being said, by time I watch the credits roll on whatever playthrough I'm doing, I know it was time well spent. I can only imagine what Transistor would have been if it hadn't been a follow-up to Bastion though. Maybe more in-depth focus on the turn-based system, maybe not forcing the leveling system that didn't really add much, I don't know. I suppose it doesn't really matter though. Transistor is what it is, and what it is an incredibly ambitious, creative game with jaw-dropping presentation and a very well-developed world, tied together by gameplay that is, unfortunately, often at odds with itself. Is it a bad game? Of course not, but it feels like mechanically there's a bit of an identity crisis going on, and the amazing world and style can only compensate so much. So that game down, I guess I'll be moving on to Supergiant's next game, Pyre. I've never actually played Pyre before, so I'm interested to see what that game's actually like. To be honest though, I think I'm gonna take a break from Supergiant games for now, because I don't want to get burnt out on them, because if I just play through them constantly, I may start to have opinions that I may not otherwise had if I just gave it a clean slate look. So next time, I think I'll be doing something a little different. Thank you for watching. I'll see you guys next time. Later. Hey people, it's ScionVyse, everyone's favorite sword with a voice. Now today I'm going to talk about a game that I personally identify with, Transistor. As a sword with a voice, I understand all of the hardships the game's protagonist, the Transistor, has to go through. And because of this, it's easily one of my favorite games